Let's get started. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Andres, in case I don't know some of you. I'm a CS faculty here, affiliated with CITP. And I have the pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Samantha Dalal. Is a fellow here at CITP. I've known Samantha since we were just talking about this. I got an email from her in 2021 in March, before I even joined Princeton. At the time, her advisor was like, oh, you should meet this student. She's amazing. She's doing really cool work. And we've been collaborating since then. So we're really excited to have her here at Princeton, finally. And she's going to be talking about something that she hopes to turn into a paper, maybe. And so she welcomes feedback on that. So with that, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andres. Don't worry, you guys can applaud a lot at the end. So I'm really excited to speak to you all today about some work that I've been doing to investigate how we can contest the outcomes from automated decision-making systems and the types of regulatory and enforcement structures that I think should be in place in order to make accountability possible. And a quick disclaimer, as Andres said, this talk is based in part on work I did for the last chapter of my dissertation, and it's the only piece of my dissertation that's not published as a standalone paper. So I'm really looking for thoughts and advice on how to turn this chapter into its own standalone piece. So that would be very much appreciated at the end. Okay, so a little bit of an overview. Today's talk is going to have 3 parts. So first, I'm going to tell you a little story. We'll have story time to explain how automated decision-making system, or ADSs, as I'll be referring to them throughout the talk, show up in the context of gig work, and why I think gig work is a helpful context for studying ADSs. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my time arguing with ADSs while doing ethnographic research as a labor organizer for a union that represented gig workers. And finally, I'll conclude with some lessons learned from my empirical work that I think can guide how regulatory and enforcement capacities should be constructed to establish accountability in contexts where ADSs are deployed. Okay, so I want to introduce you all to Michael. Michael is an Uber driver who experienced firsthand what it's like to try to dispute the outcome of an ADS. And he had come to a deactivation clinic that I was working at in Denver. And these clinics are basically like support centers where drivers can get help from an organizer to dispute an outcome that they don't agree with. And Michael had been deactivated, which is the gig work equivalent of being fired. And this basically means that he's locked out of his Uber driver app due to accusations of fraudulent activity for having created multiple accounts linked to his name. But Michael insisted that he had never created multiple accounts on Uber. He told me that he was a victim of identity theft, and he was convinced that someone could have maybe sold his identity documents and used these to create a second Uber account under his name. Which I know sounds like a reach, very far-fetched, but this is actually a surprisingly common occurrence in the ride-hail world. There's a really active black market for stolen work accounts and identity documents in the gig economy, as reported by the Tech Transparency Project and even journalistic outlets like Wired. So this seemed like a pretty straightforward case to resolve. Michael had documentation to prove that his identity was stolen. He had a police report. He had an identity theft claim that he filed with the US government. He had new identity documents with an issuance date. He just needed to talk to somebody at the platform to explain his situation and get help uploading his evidence. And Michael and I spent like an hour and a half on the phone navigating through a maze of preset menus and different driver support agents, and every person we talked to told us something different about what evidence Michael needed to appeal his deactivation. And a few days later, Michael submitted all of his evidence as we were directed to do, and he received a message from yet another Uber driver support agent. His account would remain deactivated, but now it's deactivated for safety concerns instead of fraudulent activity, which is what we had called about in the first place. And worst of all, in this message, the agent made it very clear that there was no appeal possible. Okay, so Michael could not contest this deactivation decision, and he's permanently locked out of his livelihood. Michael's disappointing outcome is not unique. Every day, drivers like him are deactivated from ride-hail platforms and given little to no explanation about how this decision was made. Absent other measures of control for a workforce of independent contractors, platforms like Uber and Lyft rely on automated decision-making systems to constantly ingest data about how their workers are behaving, what the ratings are from passengers, and they use a whole combination of this information to evaluate worker performance and determine an outcome. How platforms utilize ADSs in their deactivation process and whether a human is involved in the process at all is not public information. Workers are often left in the dark about why a decision occurred and who they could speak to for help. And in the case that they do want to appeal a deactivation, platforms often route drivers through forms and automated chats. Reaching a person is extremely difficult. If an employee like you or me disagreed with a management decision, we could likely get hold of a manager, another person, to explain to us why the decision was made. But for workers like Michael, ADSs have eaten the manager, leaving them with few options for recourse. And these ADSs are increasingly ingrained in the social and administrative fabric of everyday life. They're in our workplaces, they're used to determine access to credit and loans, they can even help determine our access to life-saving healthcare interventions. But what happens when we disagree with the outcome of an ADS, or when the outcome is harmful? How can we argue with these systems? How can we hold these systems accountable for the decisions that they help to make? Well, for the past 22 months, I've been investigating how workers in the gig economy dispute the outcome of ADSs in the context of account deactivation. And my investigation has taken place at 2 field sites, one in Denver and one in Seattle. And at each field site, I partnered with a local union that provided support services for deactivated drivers. And the field sites differ pretty dramatically in terms of the extent of driver support services offered and regulatory environments in which the driver support services operated. In Denver, CIDU, or Colorado Independent Drivers United, ran these informal deactivation clinics where organizers would try to help deactivated drivers contact the platform, get more information, and file an appeal through the platform. But because there are, or at least during the field work, were no regulations governing the process of deactivation, the support services couldn't really do too much for the drivers. They could only try to help drivers understand the information that they were given and get in contact with a support agent. In Seattle, Drivers Union, or DU, runs a driver resource center that's funded by a 15-cent fee on each trip that occurs in Washington state. And the Driver Resource Center employs 3 attorneys and several paralegals that provide drivers with legal representation in the deactivation appeals process. There are also several regulations on the books in Seattle and Washington state that are really important, but I'll talk about these a little bit later. And before I jump into findings from studying contestation of ADSs in this specific context, I'm going to give you a quick primer on deactivations. So, as I mentioned before, deactivation is the gig work equivalent of being fired. So drivers are locked out of the platform, and they're prevented from going online and working when the company determines that the drivers have violated their community guidelines, which are typically a very broad set of rules. And common reasons for deactivation include passenger and vehicle safety, document and background checks, and account verification. And on its face, these reasons seem perfectly understandable. I also want to make sure that platforms are offering access to safe and reliable drivers, but upon scrutiny, each of these reasons becomes a bit more troubling. So drivers can be deactivated for passenger and vehicle safety reasons, and platforms measure these violations according to their own policies by looking at quantitative ratings from passengers, running software on drivers' phone to track telemetrics like harsh braking, sudden acceleration, and terms of service violations, such as passenger complaints that drivers are denying a trip with a service animal. However, passenger ratings are known to encode both racial and gender biases against workers, and driving telemetrics can also be unreliable. There's many cases where harsh braking or sudden acceleration are merited, like most of us have probably driven before. Sometimes you have to brake really hard. Another reason for deactivation is failure to pass document and background checks. So this happens when you have discrepancy with identity documents, maybe the driver has a suspended license or they have flags on their background check. But prior research has also shown that there are issues with verifying identity documents, especially with people who are non-binary or genderqueer. And there could also be systemic issues with background checks, who ends up being flagged, what are the vendors running the background checks, etc. And finally, one of the other reasons for deactivation is account verification. And this is something that a previous CITP fellow has written about extensively, Elizabeth Watkins. drivers are asked to submit random facial verification checks. So they have to like take a picture of their face to ensure that they are who they say they are in their like driver's license or official identity documents. But these facial verification checks also have systematic failures. But today I'm going to focus a little bit on the autoethnographic and ethnographic work I did in Denver. And the last part of this talk, I'll come back to Seattle a little bit more to talk about regulation and enforcement. So I conducted field work at CIDU's deactivation clinic between January 2024 and March 2025. I attended 10 of these clinics, eight of which I worked at as an organizer. So in total, I completed about 30 hours of field work. And just a disclaimer, while I was working at the clinics, I did not accept any payment from CIDU for my time. And during my time in the field, I generated 3 key data artifacts that I continued to revisit throughout my analysis process. So first, I created personal journal entries that were comprised of notes that I took down while working as an organizer about my experience trying to contest a deactivation, as well as transcribed voice notes I recorded to document the affective experience of doing this type of work. I also collected field notes of my ethnographic observations of how other organizers were helping drivers in their appeals process. And finally, I did document analysis of anonymized deactivation intake forms that every organizer has to fill out when a new driver comes into a clinic. And these intake forms is basically where we capture information about the driver and their recollection of the deactivation and our process of trying to get in contact with the support agent. So what exactly happens at a deactivation clinic? Basically, drivers arrive, and because the CIDU clinic is not funded by any external mechanisms, it's only available to drivers who are members of the union that's running the clinic. So they have to arrive and check in and verify that they are signed up as a union member, because the dues that union members paid were used to pay the other organizers who came to work at the clinic. Once they were checked in, we would do intake and documentation. So we would fill out the deactivation intake forms, we'd write down the driver's recollection of the event, and then, and I'll talk about steps 3 and 4 in much more detail in a moment, we would go through the Sisyphean task of trying to contact a human support agent, and then we would, if we could, contact a person, we would ask the support agent for more information and to please consider an appeal. Okay, so what does it look like to try to get in contact with a human driver support agent? Basically, when people come to the deactivation clinic, like they want to speak to a person, okay? Drivers want to speak to someone at the platform and have someone tell them what's going on, okay? They're not coming because they want another like notice or policy printout, okay? They want to talk to someone. So first, we try to see, can we contact a driver support agent via a phone number? Is there a phone number available for us to call? And if there's no phone number available, we would go into the driver's apps and we would see if there maybe is a phone number listed within the app, because maybe the phone number is not publicly available, only drivers can access it, that's reasonable. But if there's no phone number in the app, then we would have to try to do the chat feature and try to chat with a driver support agent, but it became increasingly difficult to get connected with a driver support agent through the chat features. So the reason why I mapped out that flow of trying to get in contact with a human is because over time, it became increasingly difficult to access a person, to get explanation from another human. So when I first started my field work in March 2024, both Uber and Lyft had 800 numbers listed on their public websites under the driver help section. We would just call the 800 number. But a couple months later, in December 2024, there's no more 800 number listed on the public website, and there's no more phone number listed within the driver app either. You would have to initiate a chat, and you could try to talk to a person through the chat, and sometimes you would get to a person, but no more calling. And then as of February 2025, the chat no longer directs to a person. It doesn't matter how many times you say, like, talk to a human, contact a support agent. It would just direct drivers to a form that they would fill out. And drivers would be asked to fill out the form with information, whatever evidence they had, and then the platform would get back to you within 3 to 5 days. But of the 8 drivers I helped, only 2 heard back from the platform after filling out the form. And in both cases, the platform just resent their deactivation notice. So there's no additional information. So even when I did manage to get in touch with a person, I was passed between multiple agents and told contradicting information about each driver's deactivation. And I experienced firsthand, and I also observed in person and read in other driver or other organizers' deactivation intake forms, how platforms' driver support agents would consistently hand off decision-making responsibility to other teams. So they would cite their lack of oversight for a specific driver's case. And this isn't like necessarily surprising. Both Uber and Lyft contract with customer success management companies like Zendesk to be the point of contact, both for disgruntled customers and disgruntled drivers, because for platforms, drivers and customers are both the same. They're both customers of their marketplace. And unsurprisingly, the workers at these contracted companies don't have access to the specific information about a driver's case, and they don't actually have the authority to make a final decision. But they are also the only point of contact that you can speak to. Driver support agents would consistently decline to provide evidence about a deactivated driver's case, choosing instead to discuss the deactivation in the broadest terms possible as a violation of community guidelines. And when asked to specify exactly which guidelines had been violated, some platform support agents would provide a reason, like low ratings, but they would decline to elaborate on what constituted a low rating, what the threshold was, what are the number of days over which, or number of trips over which a low rating was calculated. And what I gathered from my time studying how drivers and organizers at the CIDU deactivation clinics attempted to hold these systems used to make deactivation decisions accountable is that the appeals process, as it's currently designed, systematically undermines the possibility of accountability. You just can't hold these systems accountable. And I think, personally, I think this is because the appeals process as it functioned in Colorado when I was doing my field work lacked 4 key elements for accountability. So first, it does not provide the opportunity for workers to form a meaningful relationship with the platform. Accountability is not a design feature of automated decision-making systems. You cannot design a computing system to be accountable on its own, okay? Accountability is relational. To hold an ADS accountable, you have to be able to hold a person or an entity accountable for the way in which the technology is being used. Second, workers need access to information about their deactivation. Throughout my fieldwork at the clinic, I observed how workers were consistently unable to obtain a source of truth about their deactivation decision. Workers were left wondering what evidence was used to make a decision, how is evidence being used, and why does evidence merit a deactivation? Transparency in ADSs is certainly a part of accountability in these systems, but access to information in itself is definitely not enough. In addition to access to information, workers need the capacity to engage with and utilize transparency to investigate a decision and hold a platform accountable. Appealing a deactivation, even just requesting more information about a deactivation, is an extremely time-consuming process. I'm talking hours on the phone. It also requires fluency in English and the ability to know what kinds of follow-up questions to ask. Over my 15 months working at the clinic, I learned that appealing a deactivation is a skill that really takes time to get a hold of. Workers often don't have the time or the capacity to do this. Most workers I assisted live on a gig-to-gig basis, okay? They are too busy working to try to contest the results of these algorithms. And that's where the clinic comes in handy. It provides workers with access to free resources and a staff that can actually handle the process of collecting information about their deactivation and contacting driver support on their behalf. And while deactivation clinics are really popular with drivers in Denver, we always had, a line out the door of workers waiting for help. The success rate of appeals was extremely low. And I think this is in part because the appeals process lacked a key element of accountability, a way of assessing whether or not a decision was justified. The final piece of accountability, I believe, is a requirement for platforms to justify their decisions by, quote, showing their work. If drivers are given clear information about the deactivation process, it doesn't really do much good if the platform doesn't have to justify how the workers' actions constituted a policy violation. So what could accountability look like? I think in terms of relationships, the platform should create a forum where a driver and a platform representative can review the facts of a case, and I have asterisks for both driver as a platform representative here, because I think that the driver could also be represented by another party who's authorized to represent them. And also the platform representative shouldn't just be like someone contracted by Zendesk. It should be someone with actual authority to make a decision for the driver case. I think that transparency could look like platforms providing clear information about deactivation policies, review processes, and outcomes. I think that capacity could look like platforms facilitating a funding mechanism for a deactivation support organization, or basically an organization to work on behalf of deactivated workers. And I think justification could look like platforms showing their work for a deactivation decision, demonstrating why the evidence merits a deactivation. And since I've completed my fieldwork at CIDU, some measures from a recently passed state bill, SB 2475, have gone into effect, which address some of the issues I encountered while working at the deactivation clinic. So first, the bill has provisions to increase driver access to information and quality of information about deactivation policies and what constitutes a violation by requiring platforms to publish new deactivation guidelines by, I think, May of this year. Second, the bill has provisions to create a forum for relational accountability to exist by mandating that platforms create an internal deactivation appeals process that must produce documentation about how a driver's case was handled and what the outcome was. And finally, the bill creates a funding mechanism to fund driver support organizations that can provide legal assistance and representation to deactivated drivers. I think it's great that SB 75 passed. I also think it's a pretty weak bill. I don't think it's really good. And for several reasons, which I'll explain. So first of all, it relies primarily on disclosures and transparency as a mechanism for accountability. Under SB 75, platforms had to create new deactivation policies that include information about what constitutes a violation, and these policies need to be understandable to drivers. But there's no standard for what constitutes a reasonable policy, nor do platforms have to provide any evidence that they use to determine a violation to the driver or to the state. Second, the forums that platforms establish for relational accountability is an internal review process. So platforms get to write their own rules, and then they get to apply them within their own review process, which is not open to scrutiny, as long as the review is conducted in, quote, good faith. And this is kind of like the only finger hold for drivers to dispute. They could dispute that maybe the review is not conducted in good faith, and leave that up to the litigators to argue. But in one piece of good news, SB 75 does create a mechanism for funding an organization that's dedicated to helping workers take advantage of the new information disclosures and appeal a deactivation. However, the organization's efficacy is hampered by the fact that SB 75 does very little to meaningfully improve drivers' ability to appeal and hold platforms accountable for their decisions. So in Colorado, SB 75 gets part of the way there in achieving accountability. Platforms have to establish a forum in which drivers can hold them accountable for their decisions, but this forum is internal and drivers don't have a clear representative advocating for them in this forum. SB 75 mandates transparency in deactivation policies, but platforms just get to write their own rules as long as they're understandable, and platforms are not required to share any evidence that they use to determine a deactivation with the driver or the support organization. SB 75 does create a mechanism for funding a support organization, which I think is probably the only good part of the bill. There are other good parts, but in the deactivation section. But the efficacy of this organization is severely hampered by the rest of the bill. And finally, SB 75 does not create an effective mechanism to ensure that a platform justifies its decision based on the evidence of the case. So there's no sufficient justification clause. Platforms just need to follow their own deactivation policies, and they can determine if they follow their own policies in their internal review process. So I want to contrast this with the second field side of my work, Seattle. And the legislative landscape today for worker deactivations in Seattle and in Washington State is dramatically different. And I'll caveat this by saying it took over 6 years for them to create this legislative landscape in Seattle. And there's lots of other factors that go into why these types of laws were able to be passed in Seattle, which I'm happy to chat about later. So in 2019, the city of Seattle passed an ordinance that created a funding mechanism for a driver resource center that could represent deactivated drivers and help them appeal their decision. And the ordinance also mandated that platforms provide fair notice for deactivation and clear information about platform policies and actions that could lead to deactivation. Most importantly, the ordinance mandated that platforms prove their deactivation decision was justified, that the evidence supports the decision, and they have to be able to prove this in private arbitration, not just within an internal review process. In 2023, researchers at the University of Washington released a report on deactivated driver outcomes after the 2019 ordinance, and they found that 80% of drivers who appealed their deactivation under the new ordinance and were represented by the Driver Resource Center had their deactivation decisions overturned, which indicates that many of these deactivation decisions were likely arbitrary. They could not be justified or supported by the evidence in the case. With professional representation from the Driver Resource Center's legal team in private arbitration, dispute resolution time fell from 11 weeks to 7 weeks, which is great for drivers. In some cases, lost wages were collected, although the total amount has not been made public by the Driver Resource Center. Our colleagues there have told us that it was in the tens of thousands of dollars for drivers. And this 2019 ordinance fulfilled all 4 elements of accountability. It created a forum for accountability to exist that is outside of an internal platform review process. Their forum was private arbitration, which I know has problems, okay? I acknowledge that, I'm happy to talk about that too. It also created a mandate for transparency. Platforms have to have transparent policies and they need to make the evidence that they used available. That's crucial. It created a funding mechanism for driver support organizations that would provide free legal services and representation to deactivated drivers. And it set a standard for platforms to demonstrate that they could justify their deactivation decision with evidence collected about the driver's case. And this justification criteria was subject to scrutiny in private arbitration, and the Driver Resource Center attorneys could request access to the evidence used in the case to argue that the decision was not merited. Since 2019, the city ordinance has been expanded to cover all drivers in Washington state with the passage of HB 2076. Crucially, this House bill was created a process through which a Driver Resource Center would enter into negotiations with platform companies to define an appeals process for deactivations moving forward that was acceptable to both workers and platforms. HB 2076 mandated that the resulting appeals process contain something called a just cause stipulation, which the Driver Resource Center and the platforms would negotiate the terms of. And the following year, the city of Seattle passed a second ordinance to codify the appeals process agreed upon by the Driver Resource Center and platforms into law. And this agreed upon appeals process lays out guidelines for what is considered a warranted reason for deactivating a driver, mandated that drivers who have been found to be wrongfully deactivated be paid lost wages, and debars platforms that are repeat offenders from bidding on city contracts. And it also creates a process for funding enforcement of the ordinance for the Office of Labor Standards in Seattle. These protections are really strong and comprehensive, but I want to zoom in now on what I think is the crux of algorithmic accountability, which is captured in those laws that were passed in Washington, namely establishing a standard for a justified decision. And let me show you what I mean with a concrete example. So let's imagine that a rideshare platform deactivates a driver for not being online for enough hours. The platform does everything right procedurally. They give clear notice that their terms of service state that a driver must maintain minimum activity levels. They provide specific evidence. This driver was only online for 5 hours this past month. They show exactly how this violated their stated policy, and they follow their own procedures to the letter, okay? This decision is fully justified according to the platform's rules, but is it a just decision? I personally don't think so. These workers are independent contractors. They're entitled to work when they want. In fact, this flexibility is one of the main selling points of platforms that's used to recruit workers. They're told to be your own boss, work your own schedule. A policy that punishes workers for exercising the very flexibility isn't just at all. It undermines the fundamental nature of independent contracting. Without a standard of justice, without an agreement on what should be legitimate grounds for a decision or a deactivation, all other accountability mechanisms become sort of just like empty checkboxes. The goal of accountability should be to hold platforms, to hold entities using ADSs to a standard of use. So my main takeaway for regulatory and enforcement efforts that seek to establish accountability in contexts where ADSs are used is that we need to establish a standard of justice. What is a warranted reason for hiring, promotion, disciplinary, or firing decisions? What are definitely unwarranted reasons? What are the types of evidence that are needed to assess whether a deactivation was warranted? In what context will evidence be assessed? These should not be internal processes that are not subject to scrutiny or contestation. Who has the capacity to receive and make sense of evidence on behalf of workers or impacted parties? We need ways to build up and fund these infrastructures for accountability. What is the penalty for making an unwarranted decision? I think sanctions should escalate in accordance with patterns of offense. And I want to wrap up today by, acknowledging the other side of the argument here. I know that, someone could say, Samantha, these companies are perfectly within their rights to deactivate workers. In fact, most employees in the US are not entitled to any reason or justification for their termination. We're an at-will country, at-will employment country mostly, I think, except for like 2 states. Why should we unduly burden platform companies in the gig economy to provide justification for their use of ADSs when it's not the norm for any other employer? And to that I would say we should remember what's happening to drivers like Michael is not some aberration in the workplace. It is indicative of what work not could, but will look like for all of us when, and not if, automated decision-making technologies are integrated into management workflows. As AI technologies are made increasingly integral into workflows, and I emphasize the word made here, because this integration is a choice that we as humans make, I'm not really, I'm a little bit, but I'm not so much concerned about whether we'll be replaced or augmented by these new technologies, as I am worried about what it means for the organization of work. It feels increasingly like jobs are going to be turned into tasks, that employment will give way to on-demand independent contracting, and that managers will be replaced by algorithmic management. And when we study what workers like Michael are going through to try to appeal a deactivation decision, we're not looking into a porthole, we're looking at a mirror. And what I see reflected in that mirror is not a future I want for myself. If there's one thing that I learned from my many hours in the field, it's that it is a truly dehumanizing experience to have to argue with an algorithm. You don't know if anyone's listening to you. You don't know why a decision happened. You don't know if you have any power to hold someone accountable. And that's not a future of work that I want. I don't want my access to my livelihood to hinge on the outcome of a black box decision-making system. I want to be able to hold that system accountable for the decisions it makes. I want an explanation, but more than that, I want a justification. And for that to happen, yes, maybe changes to the at-will employment paradigm might be necessary. And these shifts towards just cause are not unprecedented, and they're not impossible to achieve. In fact, many states in the US today have just cause stipulations, but they definitely are necessary to ensure that in a world where offloading decisions onto ADSs and eschewing responsibility for their outcomes is easier than ever, that we can still hold companies accountable for their impacts on the labor market. And with that, thank you to my colleagues, Varun and Andres, who are here, Dana, who's not here, and Caroline and Andrew, who are an integral part of the Workers' Algorithm Observatory, made a lot of this work possible. And then my colleagues, Nari, Alicia, Angie, and Elizabeth, who read many a bad draft of this chapter and edited it. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. Can you give a sense of what percentage of drivers run into the deactivation problem?
There haven't been any comprehensive surveys of how many drivers end up being deactivated, so I can't tell you a statistic for all of the US, but I know that Power Switch Action released a report where they surveyed like 2,000 drivers in the US to understand how many had been impacted by deactivation. And I think in their survey, it was something like 70% of drivers have encountered account deactivation, or account suspension. And of those, I don't know how many, but like some percentage of those ended up having permanent deactivations from their accounts.
Wow, 70% of drivers from this survey had, that's, sorry, I'm just puzzled by that, that's a very high number of.
Yeah, so that's account suspensions, and sometimes suspensions then funnel into deactivation. So drivers can have their account suspended if their account comes under review for a flag, and sometimes when it comes under review, those get released again. Other times, it gets escalated to permanent deactivation.
Because I think the thing I'm buzzing through is, if you view it as a two-sided market, if you're saying it right, it sounds like they're just totally ignoring concerns from one side of the market. So what incentives would be there for the platforms to try to keep the labor, they wouldn't get drivers coming in, right, if they were just arbitrary in firing them.
Well, I think for platforms, actually, like in Denver, the market is like very oversaturated with drivers. Like there's too many drivers and too few passengers, and a lot of the drivers I've spoken with and the organizers I've spoken with, they have this like folk theory that deactivation is a way that the platform kind of just like culls their workforce, and reduces the number of workers to, come to a better equilibrium. But I think for platforms, there's not a strong incentive to keep workers online because there are so many other people who will just sign up and do the job, because it is relatively low barrier to entry on-demand work, especially when economic conditions aren't very good and people can't find full-time work. A lot of people turn to independent contracting or platforms. So the theory among like the worker side of things is that platforms see workers as kind of a fungible asset. There will always be another worker there that will sign up to drive for Uber, sign up to drive for Lyft. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. When it comes to sort of this feedback loop of ADSs and humans, that I think, like you were talking about suspensions versus full deactivations, is that process, is there a human at any point in that, or is it really only if you are able to contact someone that a human actually gets involved? Like at what point is the ADS control, how much of the system is the ADS actually controlling?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Unfortunately, it's really hard to find out like if a human is actually getting involved at any point, and it's variable across jurisdictions and across time. So I know the last time I checked, Lyft's deactivation policy, after they updated it in Colorado, they say like for certain types of deactivation reasons, like I think it's sexual misconduct or sexual assault, there will always be a human involved in the review. But they don't necessarily say if there's going to be a human involved in all types of deactivation decisions. So like, for example, unsafe driving, if the telemetrics demonstrate that there's harsh drive or harsh braking or harsh acceleration, it's unclear if a person gets involved to like check that data. So unfortunately, I don't have like a satisfying answer for you. It's just that like they don't make that information public. Yeah, Heidi.
I can kind of speak to that because I think I've looked at terminations of drivers actually in the UK, and there's a little bit different regulatory framework, because in the UK there is a law that you have to be told if a decision was 100% made by an ADS. And so when drivers were deactivated, they were saying, the companies were saying, well, these are templated emails, because they all sound the same if you look at them, like they're always the same language, but there would be humans involved. But I would contrast this with the National Labor Relations Board. There was a case of, this is for Amazon warehouse workers, but similar ADS decision-making concerns are the same. And they said, well, we didn't push against the union, and we didn't fire this union organizer because they started a union. We fired them because they were under our productivity measurement algorithm, and they actually put that in writing with the NLRB. No one found it, but the documents are online. And so I was like, wait, you were sort of agreeing that you're using an algorithm, and if you fall under the productivity algorithm, you will be automatically fired. Huh, interesting, because you usually say you don't do that, right? Because you don't want to get in trouble. So I think there's sort of like a couple little things we can maybe pull on. But I wanted to also say, I think you should write an op-ed for the New York Times today, because I think you're one of the few people who has evidence that, they've certainly reported on this, but they've never, I think, been able to tell that, like, you have such a high number of terminations being overruled in Washington State and so few in Colorado, and I think that is actually evidence that the process doesn't work and is probably, as you said, like, a lot of folks who are innocent get penalized here, and that's not okay. So I think that is a very big deal. I also did want to ask about, in Washington State, there are lawyers involved. Are there depositions? Are there lawsuits? Because there was, when Checker, because I know it's private arbitration, but when Checker, which is a background company, started doing some background stuff for Lyft and Uber, there were so many problems with that, and there were so many lawsuits that you can actually look in the depositions and like find, in the complaints, you can find a lot of problematic conduct by the companies.
Yeah, so in Washington, until 2027, all of deactivation dispute resolution will happen through private arbitration. After 2027, the Office of Labor Standards will start investigating unwarranted deactivations, and between now and 2027, I believe the Driver Resource Center is working with the Office of Labor Standards to translate some of their learnings on how to do these investigations.
Have you tried FOIAing any of them, getting a Freedom of Information request?
I didn't know you could FOIA an arbitration process.
Well, I don't know but the Office of Labor Standards.
I was just interviewing them, so I'll just ask them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Super, super rich and thought-provoking stuff, so thank you. I think I want to start with your second to last slide about, before that, about at-will employment. Because I guess I'm wondering, I think you're right that this is a model of decision-making that will reshape many, if not all, workplaces. And if that's true, then I think you're underselling the framing of your contribution, because what you are really saying is that algorithmic accountability is a power balancing tool to address disparities between workers and firms. And in the New Deal era, the way that we had of adjusting for those disparities was labor law. And today, because of at-will employment and because the NLRB has been completely hollowed out, labor law is far less salient than it used to be as a method of worker protection and organizing. But algorithmic accountability is actually going to be much more important. And we have misunderstood its importance as a tool of power balancing. Mm-hmm. I think that is really important as a lesson for people in how to think about the goals of algorithmic accountability. And I worry that you're selling it a little bit short by leaving till the very end the comparison to at-will employment. The problem isn't just comparing algorithmic decision-making to the at-will status quo. The problem is combined what those two things mean for the balance of power between firms and ordinary workers. And you're trying to figure out how to address that. So I think that being sort of upfront about the implications of your findings for an analysis of power would be helpful. I also wondered, if you compare these kinds of regulatory initiatives to similar efforts in other areas of tech regulation. So I'm thinking about copyright management, content moderation, right? Areas where we see quite a lot of legislative and regulatory activity, some of it successful, some of it not. being upfront about the power disparities between the firms and the workers and the way that they resonate with labor law more generally sort of makes it more obvious why we're talking about this. We're not talking about like a right to appeal a YouTube takedown or something like that. These are not the same thing, and I think you can sort of make that very plain. And in many ways, I think that second example is the thing that's like captured a lot of sort of policy attention, but this is much more far-reaching and important in my view.
Cool. Yeah, I'd definitely love to talk to you about how to do that. Yeah, Siobhan.
Maybe, so, first of all, very great talk. Building on this point in some ways, do you have a sense of sort of how some of the things that you mentioned today actually generalize to other examples beyond sort of the ride-hailing platforms? I assume there's lots of other sort of platforms where there's like contract work that happens, like I don't know, like food delivery, it's like it's closely related probably to ride-hailing applications. So I was wondering if you ever thought about sort of, is there like a more general framework that we should think about in terms of what should go into like a given sort of piece of policy, and then maybe sort of have like more detailed sort of exact elaborations for these particular kinds of applications we want to sort of enforce these particular guidelines or these specific metrics that we want to measure, stuff like that. Like have you thought about sort of this sort of generalization?
Yeah, definitely. I actually have like Hannah to thank for this. I think a lot about how kind of useless transparency is as like a mechanism for platform accountability. I think that in general, like with these types of, I don't know, machine learning systems or black box algorithms, it doesn't really do individual people much good to have more information about how does the system work. Maybe it does like experts or like researchers some good to know how a system functions, but I think my main generalizable takeaway is that like transparency always has to be coupled with capacity. So I think it makes sense for, sure, a platform should do disclosures, but they should also have identified like a party or an organization that's going to be responsible for doing something with this information and making this information useful for accountability, because information on its own is not a very useful accountability tool. Like it needs to be made into a useful tool. So,
do you, like maybe as a quick follow-up, do you feel like there is like some, there's some work around sort of trying to sort of have more pieces of legislature in sort of all of these different sort of applications that are out there, or do you feel like there's like specific interests right now for specifically the ride-hailing platforms in order to regulate sort of these deactivations? Like, is there anything in some other?
Yeah, there's definitely. I think Hilke definitely knows more about this than I do, but there are a lot of efforts to regulate like different types of algorithmic technologies in the workplace, not just with ride-hailing platforms. So like in California, I think Governor Newsom just vetoed SB 7 and now it's back in the State House or State Senate to be rewritten. And SB 7 was about like the use of automated decision-making systems in all workplace decisions except for hiring. So like promotions and I think terminations, I don't remember. And that bill is super weak. It's like 9 pages long and it's primarily focused on disclosure mechanisms. It's not really focused on like who's gonna do anything with this information. Like workers aren't just gonna say like, oh, another form I get like when I'm getting hired. Like I'm not gonna look at this, you know. Hannah brought up the AI video interviewing law in Illinois, which is similarly like a disclosures-based law. There's also local law 144 in New York that's governing the use of automated decision-making systems in hiring. And that Nate Matias has written pretty extensively about how that's kind of an empty legislative effort. It doesn't actually achieve any type of accountability. So there are lots of efforts in which people are trying to rein in the power of algorithms in the workplace, but they do seem to be fragmented across jurisdictions, and it's not really clear if they're learning from each other, like if there's any lessons learned from previous efforts and how they're updating their language or changing their strategies. So yeah.
Yeah, it seems like there's a broader sort of theme. I agree. There's like a bigger claim I think that you can make with a lot of this. So
yeah.
Very good work.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your ethnographic work. it sounds like legibility is a big issue you bring up in the kind of mechanism, right, of interpreting like how these decisions are made. And I'm curious to hear your assessment of chances for improving this legibility. Is your sense that the algorithm is a complete black box, right? There's somebody's prompting an LLM with a variety of categories and saying, tell me who the high-risk people are, or is there some kind of like symbolic rules-based system that already serves as a kind of template for increased legibility if only you had access to how these decisions would be made? I'm just curious what you mean by the algorithm is making the decision.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there definitely are ways to make these systems more legible to workers. I don't think that the decision, first of all, I think there's probably multiple decision-making systems used to manage ride-hail workers. There's probably one that looks at passenger ratings in conjunction with driving telemetrics, in conjunction with like quantitative ratings from passengers to make a determination about like unsafe driving or unsafe behavior. I think it would be helpful, maybe not for individual drivers, but for a representative of the drivers that's disputing an unjust deactivation to have access to how exactly are they analyzing telemetrics data, because it's probably rules-based. It's probably like based on a threshold of like X number of harsh braking incidents compared to like the local average of harsh braking incidents in this area that you're driving is unusual, and that's a flag, right? So I think that you could be a little bit more clear about what are the thresholds for the different decision-making systems that are being used to determine eligibility to drive. Yes. Yeah, Alejandro.
So this paradigm on online, like this theory of online platforms where you flag accounts, for instance, based on suspicion. Like you go on the app and because you are logging from a certain IP with a certain browser version and your mouse moved in a certain way, you have reason to flag the account and prevent the login or prevent creation or immediately ban the account. This is very common, for instance, in dating apps because the stakes are too high, right? Like when you have suspicion, it's better to be sort of safe than sorry than to let a bad actor go through and then it results in harm downstream. And so I'm wondering if you had a system where you could go and argue, right? Like, why did you suspend my account based on my IP and like all these things that shouldn't be grounds for, suspending my account, but yet you did. At that point, you introduce an opportunity for reversal of that, whereas you still have data to support that suspicion is something that could be prevented, and it's not something that is happening after, right? Like in your case, if you had some wrongdoing, you can say, well, you had this wrongdoing, therefore we deactivate it. But there's these other paradigms where you want to do it based on suspicion, and you want to prevent some. So I'm wondering how you think potentially about this sort of like preemptive measures versus like things that when there's wrongdoing and then you can like sort of come in and argue that and so on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that both preemptive measures and after the fact measures for account deactivation can be addressed through the appeals process. Like, I think it's fine if you think that, oh, this driver has suspicious behavior, like maybe they're going to like assault this passenger. It's kind of odd that they've gone offline after picking this person up. But I think that you need to make the evidence that you used to come to that decision to preemptively ban a driver or deactivate a driver available to them or their representative during the appeals process. I think that's important for drivers to be able to access.
I think one thing that has been kind of going around is the idea that they would make this information public, and that's very important to do a transparency point. However, I wonder if you get pushback from the organization on the argument that that information is proprietary, and it is how the company runs their business and therefore a trade secret. Do you see that kind of argument being made?
Yeah, all the time. So to clarify, I don't think that like all of these reasons or evidence need to be made public in the sense that like you and me can view them. I think in like at least in the Washington case, public just means it's part of the record in private arbitration, which is also a closed process. So that's also not, that doesn't become part of, I don't know the right legal term for it, court record, whatever it's called. Like it doesn't become like public record. The point is like the people who need to know that information are in that room. They're in like a closed door session to dispute the charges of this deactivation. I will also note that in the Washington case, there is a stipulation that like evidence that is made available, like all evidence about a driver's deactivation has to be made available to a driver and their representative in the arbitration case, except information that is deemed proprietary or can be a privacy or security risk to customers or other drivers on the platform. So they do have that exemption, and that's probably one of the most contested clauses when they go into arbitration, is what actually counts as proprietary information. Varun?
I wanted to follow up on Mihi's question actually. So going back to the point about incentives for platforms, you talked about how deactivations might be used as a way to balance supply and demand, but do you have any thoughts on why that decision should be arbitrary? So this could potentially be, well, the platform can like just pause enrollment, right, for some time. Like that's more principled than having it arbitrary. Or maybe they come up with rules to say who can be on the platform. So like why have this arbitrary decision-making process, which is potentially suboptimal for all parties involved, right? The platform, they have to go through all these lawsuits and negotiation. It's also like bad for the driver, like you're losing trust with them, they're losing their livelihood. So why like have this arbitrary kind of decision?
I mean, why not have it arbitrary? Because so few drivers will bring lawsuits independently to platforms. And if there are no regulations governing deactivation, yeah, I'm gonna do whatever I want. Like I'm gonna arbitrarily deactivate drivers, especially if my position is that drivers are a fungible asset and there will always be someone there to take their place. I wouldn't say I don't know. Maybe to give platforms the benefit of the doubt, they're probably not out there thinking like, oh, like how can we screw drivers today? Like how can we like kick people off? I don't think they even think about it that deeply. I think they just think about their marketplace and balancing their marketplace. They don't even really see drivers.
But there's you could argue there's easier ways, right? Like you could just like select a subset of drivers and give them like bad rides, and they'll probably quit the app because they don't make enough money. Like, I mean, I could totally imagine the platform doing this, right? Like if you have low ratings, you get deprioritizing the queue, and you have this internal score. They do this, right? They have this internal score, and you get less rides, right? That's like, why don't they just do that instead?
They probably do also do that.
But if they do that, why do they need to deactivate people?
I think that like deactivation is probably just a quicker way to balance supply and demand if you just like remove accounts and drivers from the platform versus like trying to wait like, oh, maybe if I get this person enough bad rides, they'll stop this work. I think there was a question in the back first, and then Tithi, and then we'll wrap up with you.
Oh yeah, I wanted to add that maybe that the really poor customer side support is potentially also reinforcing the deactivation by algorithms. And our personal anecdote where I caught a ride and the driver didn't stop and just decided to mark on the app that he picked me up. And I was frantically Googling on Reddit, Googling what to do, and several posts suggested that once the ride was over, there was nothing that I would be able to do. So I was searching everywhere on the app, there was no number, no live chat, it was late at night, and the only thing I could find was emergency. So I clicked emergency, and someone called pretty much immediately and explained that this wasn't actually an emergency situation, but I can very easily imagine this not being fed into the algorithm, and the algorithm just deciding that this driver created an emergency situation. So, and if the driver, is deactivated in that case and learns that this was because like on X date there was an emergency, that's not going to help them at all. So
yeah, I mean, I think like I'm not privy to any of the investigations that happen in Washington. They haven't invited me to sit in on the arbitration, but I think that they would probably want to like have evidence from the customer, like what happened in that case, like they're not just gonna stop at like there was an emergency situation. Like at least the litigators that work at DU, they're going to ask what was the emergency, like what happened in this case. And also in that case, I feel like that is probably like a warranted deactivation to not do the trip. Like that does count as fraudulent activity for a driver to behave in that way. TV.
I'm going back to the point that Mihir made. Are there any kind of comparative, whether you've done it or someone else, comparative studies of like different sort of areas? One argument is like there's an oversupply of drivers, but there could be places in the country or elsewhere where this demand is more than the supply. Do you see the strategies outro in places like that?
I don't know of any places where there is. I know about this more in the context of delivery work than I do in ride-hail work, and I don't know much about delivery work deactivations, but that could very well be a factor. Maybe deactivation rates and cases look really different in places where there are just not enough drivers, so platforms are incentivized to keep them on.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment directly on that. I don't know if like speculating about like the platforms, why they do this is like helpful. I think it's more like a process. I don't know if they want to call the herd or anything. Clearly they don't care about these drivers one way or the other, and I think they want to just, and some of the stuff that gets flagged, at least what I saw in documentation, it's just like weird stuff that like in housing complexes, like there's often a mail room, but the address and the GPS is for the front door. So you actually can't deliver some of the packages because you're not in the right GPS location. So that gets flagged. So maybe you have like 5 of those flags and you automatically discard it, like those kinds of things. Like I had another driver, she took helpfully all these screenshots of like the GPS telling her she should drive over a river when there was no bridge, like the GPS just got confused. So she got flagged for that because it took her longer to deliver. So I think it's more kind of like those like weird arbitrary computational signals that then just lead to a deactivation. I don't know if there was like really somebody like making policy decisions around this. I think it's like no one is clearly intervening to help. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.